Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. Any knowledge of religion in the ancient world, including Hellenistic, Egyptian, and Roman religions, as well as Christianity and Judaism, is incomplete without knowing about the contributions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies made up the last dynasty of ancient Egypt, and their story includes some pretty interesting figures, including Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Pompey, Mark Antony, and Octavian. My guest today, Davis Hankins, is writing a new book on the Ptolemies that explores their contributions to religious history. Welcome, Davis.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to get to the Ptolemies, but maybe before, if you could just kind of introduce what you do here at the university, your area of interest, and some of your other very interesting research. You're quite prolific in your writing, so
well, thanks.
I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm very happy here at Appalachian State, and I teach in the philosophy and religion department on the religious studies side, and I cover our courses that deal with biblical literature. So my degree is in Hebrew Bible, and yet I teach bi-testamental and teach New Testament as well, and other courses related to biblical literature.
And what about some of your publications up to this point? Now that you're working on the Ptolemies, but you have other books and articles?
Yeah. My first book was on the book of Job, and I've stayed working in poetry for the most part, although dabbled a little bit in some of the narrative texts, but mainly in wisdom literature, so Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and then the tradition continues in other books as well, and then in prophetic literature as well. I've published on a number of prophetic books.
I'd love to talk to you about Job if we have time at the end, but we'll get to the Ptolemies first. Do you get a chance to teach these topics in your classes, the prophets or the wisdom literature, or is it more general?
I do have a class on prophetic literature and prophets and the phenomenon of prophecy in the ancient world up through really how prophetic rhetoric has continued to influence American political history from the colonial time up through the present. And so I do a little bit with prophecy, but not much with wisdom literature. But my work in wisdom is what led to the research into the Ptolemies, because after writing the book on Job, I started to work on Ecclesiastes. And this is the period when scholars date, for good reason, like 300 to 200, the early Hellenistic period when scholars date the book of Ecclesiastes. And as you know, it is one of the, if not the weirdest book in the Bible. So I wanted to know more about the period, and that led to this whole other project, no longer simply historical backgrounds for Ecclesiastes, but a book in and of itself about the period.
So I like your characterization of the book of Ecclesiastes as one of the weirdest books in the Bible. Do you think the context here with the Ptolemaic dynasty has something to do with that kind of unique characteristic of Ecclesiastes, and how do you make that connection there?
Yes, very much. I think it has to do with the oddness of the book in the Bible. The book has long been seen as more philosophical, and maybe the closest thing you get to something like Greek philosophy in the Hebrew Bible. And so I do think there are influences there, but then there's this explosion of novel forms and content in Jewish literature written in this period from 300 to 200 that make Ecclesiastes not alone in its uniqueness. This is the first time we get Jews drawing on Babylonian sciences. So Babylonian science is old, much older than this period, and Jews had long been drawing on Babylonian literature, but never the kind of astronomical sciences that they do in this period. And that is in the beginning of the first apocalypses. So those, our earliest Dead Sea Scrolls, are Aramaic apocalyptic literature, and we don't have apocalypses before this period. This is when you get Jews for the first time ever speculating about, in rather complex systemic ways, about angels and demons and medicine. This is the first time you get medicine showing up in Jewish literature. And so Ecclesiastes is just one odd text amidst a bunch of other texts, really without which it would be difficult to imagine early Judaism or Christianity.
Yeah, so maybe we should stop a moment and just kind of describe who the Ptolemies are, who Ptolemy was, and this empire started in in 300 after Alexander the Great. Is that correct?
Right.
And then went all the way into the 1st century BC, but you're focusing on the 3 to 200 BCE period. But just tell us a little bit about who the Ptolemies were and how they brought about this kind of, I guess, new interesting worldview into Palestine and the ancient Near East.
Yeah. So the Persian Empire, so Iran, had been in control of the Levant and for a couple of hundred years, and until Alexander the Great, rather astonishingly, defeated the Persian forces in a number of key battles, and then swept all the way into basically the Indus River Valley and Pakistan. And so after defeating the Persians, shortly after, Alexander, as a young man, surprisingly died in Babylon. And so his generals fought over the territory, which took a couple of decades before things finally settled. But Ptolemy had been general in Alexander's army and took control over Egypt and southern Syria, including Israel, Palestine, around the year 300. And so the Ptolemies is the dynasty that extends from Ptolemy I all the way through Cleopatra, as you mentioned, and the period around the transition from the Roman Republic to empire. And so the longest dynasty in Egyptian history are the descendants of this Macedonian family, who spoke Greek and identified in many ways with Greek culture and customs, but they were a minority Macedonian population controlling Egypt, southern Syria, and Palestine until around the year 200, when the Seleucids, who were the Hellenistic rulers in control of the Mesopotamian territories, defeated the Ptolemies and pushed them back into Egypt and took control of southern Syria, Palestine, Jerusalem included. So that's really around the year, it's a pretty clean century from around 300 to 200, known as the early Hellenistic period, when the Ptolemies are building up Alexandria. So Alexander founds Alexandria in his name, and that becomes the capital and the center of the kingdom. And for 100 years, the regime in Alexandria, the administration, is controlling the territory, and they do some fascinating things that I think deeply influences Jewish intellectual history.
So this is really a melting pot of cultures, it sounds like, during this period. You've got the Macedonian family bringing in Hellenistic and Greek culture into Egypt, which has a long-standing cultural life itself, right?
Right.
Was there an effort to wipe out the existing culture, or is there more of a syncretism of ideas and religions and cultures, a mixing there during that time period?
Yeah, very much a mixing, and we continued to have Egyptian temples and priests, and there were efforts the Ptolemies made to undermine some of the old holders of power, but they were a small minority, and they settled a bunch of Greek and other peoples, primarily mercenaries in Egypt, but they probably never exceeded 10% of the population. So Egypt remained Egypt and largely populated by Egyptians, and Egyptian culture continued, but now under a different and new regime that did bring some new ideas, founded the new city. It's, of course, famous for the lighthouse being one of the 7 wonders of the world, and the library, the museum, and other sort of cultural institutions.
So the Ptolemies also controlled the area we call Palestine, right? And this is where some of these ideas came into Jewish thought, right?
Right.
All right. So can you give me maybe a couple of concrete examples of how this new worldview or mixing of cultures from Hellenistic religions and Egyptian traditions now filtering into Palestine with the old Hebraic formulas for worship and so forth? Give me some examples of how that might have changed Judaic thinking.
Well, actually, I'm happy to do that, but it's, I think, my research suggests that it's primarily not through cultural forms that you get these new ideas spreading through Egypt and into Palestine, but I think primarily through administrative and economic new ideas, a whole new way of imagining the economy. So a couple of concrete examples you asked for would be they create a new taxation scheme so that no longer, as had been the case for Egyptian and people in the Persian Empire and the empires before, no longer were you taxed on the basis of the amount that you produced. Instead, they introduced tax farming so that local people were in charge of covering the tax revenue for an area, and then where others were in control of collecting the taxes, but also they assessed the taxes ahead of time. So there's this comprehensive, really incredible effort to calculate how much would be produced by the administrators, and we have all of these documents, and I can talk about where are these documents, where they come from and stuff too, but we have all of these administrative documents that show how much information is being collected, how many calculations are being made, and there's a clear chain of communication to Alexandria and then back down to the local level where we can see local scribes struggling to convey to people the responsibilities that they have for the year ahead of time, so that now farmers begin the year in debt, as opposed to at the harvest giving 10% or whatever it would be of the harvest to as one's tax obligations. Now one started the year knowing how much the administration expected you to grow and then being obliged to give however much you were assessed to the administration at the end of the harvest, regardless of the kind of vagaries and different things that could happen that could cause the harvest not to end up being what the
My guess is they didn't get a refund if the harvest didn't make, right?
Right. And there are lots of documents that we have attesting to frustrations among local scribes trying to communicate these new ideas, and local farmers being frustrated with these speculative, future-oriented, this new taxation system. Another big change that the Ptolemies introduced is coinage. So coinage had been around prior to the Ptolemies, introduced in the Persian period, but the big innovation the Ptolemies create is fiat currency. So they devalue their currency compared to all the Attic standard that's used everywhere in all the other Hellenistic kingdoms around the Mediterranean, and they essentially devalued their own coinage, but declared at different moments that it was worth X. So now you have this new abstract sense of the coin is just worth what it's worth because the king said it's worth that. It doesn't have anything to do with the amount of precious metal in the coin. In fact, the Ptolemies used primarily bronze coinage, and they introduced a capitation tax so that everybody was responsible for paying in coins, and that required them to distribute coins into the economy, and they create this vast banking system. Again, banks had existed earlier in Greece, but not the way they were in Ptolemaic Egypt, so that you could deposit funds in a royal bank in Syria and then travel to Alexandria and withdraw them in Alexandria. They kept records and communicated among the banks so that it, much like we think of a banking system, which is just incredible. The amount of information they're collecting and sharing, and the amount of papyrus that we have.
So it's fascinating the way you're approaching the history here from this economic standpoint, and this is revolutionary. And I would imagine that if we go back to Palestine and you have the Jews who are now being imposed a whole new system from outside, this must have created tension and ill feelings towards these outside administrators. And I guess you get did the Romans continue this? Because you get a little hint of this in the New Testament over taxation and the financial institutions that existed there. Did the Romans inherit this from the Ptolemies, or did they have their own system in place?
Yeah, I think in large, I think there was some dependency from the Hellenistic kingdoms more broadly in the Romans, but I'm not. That's later than my period, and but it's a period that, speaking of New Testament and Old Testament and biblical scholarship, at least, this really is a period that has long been neglected, because for the most part, if you took your survey class of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, you might talk about the revolution, the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire, who comes to reign again in 200, and then the revolution breaks out in 167, and there's some texts in Daniel related to that. But most of the history that you would have covered in your Hebrew Bible class ends with the Persian period and the conquest of Alexander, and then there's this 100-year period. And if you took a New Testament class, you would probably begin with the Maccabean revolt and the creation of an independent kingdom in Israel for the first time in hundreds of years, and then that would be backgrounds for understanding the political context of the early Jesus movement would begin there. So really this period from 300 to 200 has fallen out of biblical scholarship, and there's been tons of fascinating historical work done on the period by papyrologists and folks working on Demotic, which is the local Greek Egyptian language, and then folks working in Greek, and it just hasn't made its way into the study of early Judaism and biblical scholarship.
So your book will fill a gap
right
here in terms of historical scholarship.
Right.
Yeah, so so did the Ptolemaic Empire, it didn't end in 200 when the Seleucids took over, or did it? Is that the end? Because the rulers from the Ptolemies continued right up to the Roman period, is that correct?
Correct. So the famous Cleopatra being the final pharaoh and descendant from the Ptolemaic line. But yes, the Ptolemies continued to rule Egypt, again, the longest dynasty in the whole history, long history of Egypt, and yet the Seleucids took over control of southern Syrian Palestine.
Syrian Palestine,
yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about religious syncretism during that period. I would imagine that there was borrowing both ways, that Egyptian culture was affected by the Ptolemaic Empire, and maybe some the other way as well. Was there any sort of religious revolution during this time period, or how did religion in Egypt change during the Ptolemaic period?
There is some evidence of the Ptolemies like diverting some tax revenue from certain temples, and in some ways undermining, I think, the power that the priesthood had previously had in Egyptian politics over and economics over the populace. But the Ptolemies also very much presented themselves as pharaohs, and they very much adopted and worked with priesthood, the priests and temples, in order and used the scribes that had been trained and continued to work in temples as well as in the royal administration.
Through the existing priesthood of the Egyptian priesthood.
Right. Yeah. But they wear the pharaonic headdress, and they dress like Egyptian pharaohs, and they take the title and very much present themselves as the new pharaonic regime.
That's interesting. I've got an image here, the first image we have, which is, I didn't recognize it, but I came across it. Apparently it was one of the symbols of the Ptolemaic regime, and it's supposed to be the eagle of Zeus, which I found interesting, particularly since you're portraying the Ptolemies as taking on this Egyptian persona, I guess. Yet Zeus and the eagle representing them would speak to the kind of Greek and Macedonian heritage.
Yes, and so there was lots, as you said, syncretism. There were new Greek ideas and stories that were brought in. There's a very famous, the so-called pomp of Ptolemy II, the like we say pomp and circumstance, this massive procession which largely celebrated Dionysus, and so you do get the introduction and the worship of Greek gods, including of the Ptolemies themselves as gods, and then you also had the ongoing worship of Egyptian gods, and Isis and Osiris continued to be very important in the Ptolemaic period, and you also get new gods and cults funded to support the worship of new gods.
Yeah, so it's a really exciting time in terms of religious diversity, and you're right, we talk a little bit about all of this in our introductions to New Testament and literature. But I've never really thought about so much in terms of the Ptolemies themselves as contributing to this kind of melting pot of religious ideology and philosophy and so forth.
Right, and I think that is, there's good reason for that, because, and why it's been neglected in some ways in biblical scholarship, because you do not find Jews in the 200s wrestling naked in the gymnasia, or building homes with Corinthian columns, and these places that we normally find evidence of cultural influence on architecture and ideas and art, and you don't find it there. But I do think that I've uncovered a significant amount of evidence suggesting how exactly did these new Ptolemaic ideas infiltrate and make their way into Palestine and influence Jewish scribes, and that is, I think, primarily through economic and administrative means.
That's really interesting, yeah. So I found a reference that I had not heard before in relation to the Ptolemies, but at one point I found that Ptolemy the First was eventually referred to as Soter, or Savior. Is that an innovation in terms of how rulers were seen? Is this the beginnings of an imperial cult, or is that already in place with the Egyptians?
Well, I think there were times when Pharaoh was seen as a divine being in Egyptian history, and so that may have influenced the introduction of the imperial cult with the Ptolemies, but you do find Hellenistic rulers both in Ptolemaic Egypt and elsewhere being divinized, and their worship being supported through funding and new tasks for Egyptian temples and new festivals and holidays celebrating the rulers as divine beings.
Is that language carried over into Christianity? Is there any influence there, do you think, through Judaism, or language of Soter or Savior, or the idea that a divinized king could function in some way as a savior god?
Right, yeah. I think when the New Testament, for example, when the angel announces to Mary that she's going to bear a child and that the child will be a savior and will rule nations, and it is there's another ruler in town, right? And that's the Roman emperor by then. And I think in many New Testament texts you do find push back against the worship of emperors as gods, as well as the posing of the alternative human divine being that one should worship, which would be the one, of course, executed by the state.
Right, and that execution was at least partially based on this kind of idea that the religious figure would also be a political ruler.
Right, yeah, all the language around the king of the Jews.
Right, yeah. All right, so I know that Cleopatra is outside the realm of your research, but she's such an interesting figure. How does the Ptolemaic dynasty come to an end, in just sort of broad strokes?
It comes to an end when Mark Antony teams up with Cleopatra against Octavian, who will be Augustus Caesar, and Augustus wins, primarily through his naval prowess against the joint forces of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Cleopatra seems to have wanted to restore the glories of the earlier Ptolemaic dynasty and hitched her wagon to the wrong horse with Mark Antony. And so then Egypt becomes a breadbasket, really supporting Rome, which is, of course, a giant city in the ancient world, and they're not growing enough food to feed everybody. But Egypt, of course, with the Nile, is regularly shipping grain to Rome to feed all of these urban dwellers.
Oh, wow. There's one other kind of curious part of the Ptolemies' lifestyle that I might get you to comment on, but apparently the practice of sibling marriage, royal marriages, was common with the Ptolemies, as it had been with Egyptian culture. What's the idea behind marrying one's sibling or cousin? Is it to keep the royal bloodline pure, or is there more to it than that?
My first response, I think, would be that it's more about eliminating rivals to the throne. And there were lots of infighting among the Ptolemaic regime, even by the time, continuing up through Cleopatra. And you get sometimes descendants of the Ptolemies married off to other kingdoms. So the Seleucids and the Ptolemies sometimes would intermarry with their their children, primarily the Ptolemies sending folks. But I think it is primarily more about, yes, I mean, in some ways solidifying control, but also eliminating potential rivals to the throne.
Okay, all right. So you mentioned that you've been working on this research now for about 8 years. Where are you in the timeline for actually producing this book?
All chapters have been drafted,
Okay.
so I'm very hopeful that I can. In fact, I'm in conversations with an acquisitions editor, and I've told her that I think that I could have a draft ready to go to submit to the review process by the end of the summer, or maybe the end of August.
Oh, wow, congratulations. That's when the real work begins, though, right?
Right.
So you began this, and we've got a couple minutes left, but you began this by referencing Ecclesiastes, okay, and saying that that's what piqued your interest in the historical context. And you mentioned that Ecclesiastes is maybe some of the closest of the Hebraic literature comes to reflecting Greek philosophy. Can you give some examples about what makes the book of Ecclesiastes, in your words, weird or unique in terms of the wisdom literature of the Hebrews?
Yeah, it's commonly characterized as very skeptical literature. It's very skeptical about what one can know. It sees the world as maybe 38 times, I think, in the book is repeated this term hevel in Hebrew, which is translated in the King James famously as vanity. So vanity of vanities, says the teacher, all is vanity is kind of a key line from the book. And so I think it is pushing back in the context of the Ptolemies' interest in calculating the total productive capacities of the world and optimizing the amount of revenue that they can bring in. And Ecclesiastes is pushing back to say you actually don't know how much the world doesn't add up the way that you're trying to make it add up. And so pushing back to say that there's something insubstantial, fleeting, and kind of like vaporous about reality, both because I think there are so many changes being brought by the Ptolemies, but also such an optimistic sense that one can calculate the totality of productive potential. And then you've got apocalyptic texts emerging at the same time that are also, unlike Ecclesiastes, very confident about calculating the times and spaces of the world. So I think that this is a broad conversation that Ecclesiastes is engaged in.
So Ecclesiastes would, in some sense, have been a pushback against some of these reforms that were going on. Would the Ptolemies have recognized that, or would they?
I doubt it. I doubt they knew anything about
right under the radar screen.
Yeah,
is that right?
Right.
So the apocalyptic texts, those were coming out of the Hebrew literature, though, right? So you're suggesting, I think, that Ecclesiastes was also pushing back against that apocalypticism that was
right. Yeah, it both pushes back against the sense that one could calculate the times and seasons of life. There's the famous poem about there's a time for this and a time for that, but the commentary on the poem, it clearly says the problem is you can never know what time it is. And then you don't know what happens to you when you die, and don't believe anybody who tells you that they know what happens to people after death. And so also pushing back against some ideas about the afterlife that I think are emerging in Jewish literature at the same time.
Yeah. Well, this is all very fascinating. Do you have a last word about the Ptolemies before we end this?
Well, just that I think fascinating is a great word. They have really captured my imagination and interest, and I'm excited for the book to come out and really appreciate the chance to talk about it.
I'm excited to see it.
Thanks.
I can't wait. All right, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life this week. I hope you'll join us again next week on App TV, or next season, since this is the last show of this season. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.